In 1942, American workers built an entire ocean-going cargo ship in 4 days. Not 4 months, not 4 weeks, 4 days. Today, in 2025, the United States Navy has spent 17 years building one aircraft carrier. It is still not fully operational. In 1942, the SS Robert E. Peary, 441 feet long, 14 million pounds of steel, was assembled in 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. The keel was laid at midnight on November 8th. By November 12th, the ship was in the water. On November 22nd, it sailed to war. In the present day, in 2025, the USS Gerald R. Ford has cost $13 billion. Construction began in 2005. The ship was commissioned in 2017. It achieved operational capability in 2021. 17 years. One ship. In 1942, at the peak of production, American shipyards launched 3 Liberty ships every single day. 2,710 ships in 4 years. Each ship could carry 2,840 jeeps, 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of ammunition. We built them faster than the enemy could sink them. Today, in 2025, we are building the 3rd Ford-class carrier. It will not be delivered until 2029, and it is already delayed. In 1942, they welded 250,000 parts together in less than a week. Workers, most untrained, many women, learned to weld in 2 weeks and built ships in 42 days. In the present day, highly trained engineers with computer-aided design and robotic welding systems take 12 years to build one carrier. The ships of 1942 were not better. The workers were not superhuman. But something has been lost. A capacity, a method, a willingness. This is forensic investigation. How did we build so fast? What was the secret weapon? And why, in 2025, with better tools, better materials, better knowledge, can we no longer do it? The answer is in the welds. The answer is in the bodies. The answer is in a single law, signed in 1970, that changed everything. In 1942, Henry Kaiser faced an enemy that could not be negotiated with: time itself. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships at a rate of 8 per day. In 1941 and 1942, submarines sent 2,963 Allied ships to the bottom. The United States built 863 to replace them. The math was killing the Allies. At the conventional shipbuilding pace of 1940, 230 days per ship, America would lose the war before it could supply its troops. Traditional shipbuilding made speed impossible. Here is what it looked like in 1940. A ship was built from the keel up, one piece at a time. Teams of riveters, 3 to 4 men per rivet, drilled holes through steel plates, heated rivets until they glowed orange, drove them through, hammered them flat. One rivet at a time. Each Liberty ship required 150,000 rivets. Each rivet required a skilled team. Each team could drive perhaps 200 rivets per day. At that pace, the riveting alone consumed weeks. Worse, riveting required highly skilled labor. In 1940, a riveter needed 6 months of training. By 1942, every skilled shipbuilder was either employed or drafted. There were not enough trained workers. There would never be enough. Using the conventional methods available in 1940, the United States could not have built ships fast enough to replace wartime losses. The war would have been lost in the Atlantic. Time was the enemy, and time was winning. In 1940, Henry Kaiser invented a solution. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder. He was a dam builder. Before 1940, he had built the Hoover Dam. He understood mass production, assembly lines, how to move earth and steel in quantities that defied imagination. In late 1940, Kaiser received a contract from the British government to build 30 cargo ships. He looked at traditional methods and saw the problem. The work was being done in the wrong place. Traditional shipyards built ships on the slipway. Every piece was assembled there. Only one crew could work on each section at a time. The slipway became a bottleneck. Kaiser's solution: build the ship before it reaches the slipway. He called it modular prefabrication. In 1941, Kaiser built massive fabrication shops away from the water. Workers assembled entire sections, deck houses, double-bottom sections, stern frame assemblies, bow units, on their sides or upside down. Welding horizontal is easier than welding vertical. Welding on the ground is easier than welding on scaffolding 40 feet up. These prefabricated modules were enormous. Some weighed 50 tons. The largest weighed 70 tons. Workers built these sections in factories across the United States, loaded them onto railroad flat cars, rolled them into the shipyard. Giant cranes lifted the modules into position. Welders fused them together. By the time the keel was laid in 1942, 80% of the steel was already assembled. But the real weapon was not the modules. The real weapon was the welds. Kaiser replaced rivets with electric arc welding. Ford Motor Company had been welding car bodies since the 1930s, but it had never been used at this scale in shipbuilding. Welding was faster, much faster. A welder could fuse 2 steel plates in the time it took a riveting team to drive a handful of rivets. Welding was lighter. Riveted joints required overlapping plates and thousands of heavy rivets. This added 300 tons of weight to a medium-sized merchant ship. Welded joints eliminated the overlap and the rivets. The ship was lighter. It could carry more cargo. But the most important advantage, welding could be learned in 2 weeks. In 1942, Kaiser's shipyards recruited women, minorities, immigrants, wounded veterans, and men classified 4F, medically unfit for military service. These were not skilled shipbuilders. Many had never worked in a factory. Some had been farmers. Some had been waitresses. Kaiser trained them to weld in 2 weeks. Then he put them to work. Each Liberty ship required approximately 50 miles of welding seams. In 1942, workers laid those welds in sections, in shops, on the ground, in controlled conditions. By the time the sections reached the slipway, most of the dangerous, difficult welding was done. If you could see through the hull of a Liberty ship in 1942, you would find a circulatory system of welds, veins of molten steel fusing plate to plate, a hidden skeleton stronger than rivets and faster to build. The SS Robert E. Peary, the ship built in 4 days, 15 hours, used 17 banks of welding machines on each side of the hull. 34 welding stations working simultaneously. The deck was pre-assembled in 7 sections instead of 23. The deck houses arrived fully outfitted. Bunks installed, fans mounted, flooring laid. When the keel was laid at midnight on November 8, 1942, the ship was already half-built. The workers were not assembling a ship. They were assembling a ship from pre-built pieces. It was not construction, it was assembly. By the end of 1945, the Richmond Kaiser Shipyards had built 747 ships. Across all 7 of Kaiser's shipyards, workers built 1,490 vessels, 27% of all ships ordered by the U.S. Maritime Commission during the war. Kaiser's ships were completed in 2/3 the time, and at 1/4 the cost of the average of all other shipyards. The SS Robert E. Peary sailed to war on November 26, 1942. It carried supplies to the Pacific, transported ammunition to combat zones. During its service, the Peary saved American soldiers trapped near a beach held by the Japanese. The ship survived the war. It was scrapped in June 1963 in Baltimore. 21 years of service, built in 4 days. Today, in 2025, 83 years after the Peary was launched, only 3 Liberty ships still exist. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien is in San Francisco. The SS John W. Brown is in Baltimore. The SS Red Oak Victory is in Richmond, California. These ships are museums now. Visitors walk their decks and marvel. They do not understand what they are looking at. They are looking at a lost technology. Not lost because we do not know how to weld. Lost because we no longer have the will to build this way. In 2025, building a ship the way Kaiser built the Liberty ships would be illegal. Start with the National Environmental Policy Act, signed into law on January 1, 1970. Before 1970, an engineer could design a shipyard, select a site, and begin construction within months. After 1970, any major federal action requires an environmental impact statement. The EIS process involves multiple stages. An agency must publish a notice of intent, conduct scoping, prepare a draft EIS, hold a public comment period, minimum 45 days, then prepare a final EIS, hold another comment period, minimum 30 days, then issue a record of decision. In 2009, federal agencies completed 715 environmental impact statements. Major infrastructure projects can take years. In 1942, Kaiser built an entire shipyard in less than a year. Construction began in 1941. The first keel was laid on September 17, 1941. In the present day, in 2025, the approval process alone would take longer. Then there is OSHA. The Occupational Safety and Health Act was signed in 1970. OSHA establishes workplace safety requirements. In 2025, a shipyard must provide personal protective equipment, conduct safety training, document hazards, limit noise exposure, control toxic substances. These are good requirements. These requirements save lives, but they also slow construction. In 1942, workers were injured at a rate of 7.3 injuries per 100 employees. In 2025, OSHA's recordable injury rate target is significantly lower. Achieving that target requires time, documentation, process. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the aircraft carrier that took 17 years, uses modular construction. The shipyard assembles large sections in shops and lifts them into place with cranes. It is the same basic principle Kaiser used in 1942, but the Ford took 17 years. Why? Because the Ford has 23 new untested technologies. Because the design was not finalized before construction began. Because each technology required testing, validation, certification. Because the electromagnetic aircraft launch system failed 4,165 times before it worked. Because the weapons elevators did not function. Because the approval process for each change required reviews, committees, documentation. In 1942, if a foreman saw a problem, he fixed it. On the spot, with a welding torch and a hammer. In 2025, if an engineer sees a problem, he files a report. The report goes to a review board. The board schedules a meeting. The meeting produces a recommendation. The recommendation requires approval from multiple agencies. The approval process takes months. This is the system working exactly as designed. In 1942, the system was designed for speed. In 2025, the system is designed for safety. We chose safety. We lost speed, and we cannot get it back. Henry Kaiser was not a shipbuilder. He was a bulldozer. Before 1940, Kaiser had spent 2 decades moving mountains. He built the Hoover Dam between 1931 and 1936, the Bonneville Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam. In 1940, Kaiser had never built a ship. What he had was a philosophy. Anything can be mass-produced if you break it into small enough pieces. In December 1940, Kaiser received a contract from the British government to build 30 cargo ships. Traditional shipyards were quoting 12 to 18 months per ship. Kaiser quoted 230 days. Then he started cutting. His management philosophy was brutally simple. Identify the bottleneck, eliminate it, move to the next bottleneck. No committees, no lengthy deliberations. Decisions made in hours, not weeks. His son, Edgar Kaiser Sr., was appointed vice president and general manager of the Richmond shipyards in 1941. Edgar was 33 years old. Together they built an industrial empire that employed over 100,000 workers at its peak. They built it in 3 years. In 1942, there was no 40-hour work week at the Kaiser Shipyards. There was no weekend. The shipyards operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 3 shifts, rotating continuously. The work never stopped. At the peak in late 1942, the Richmond shipyards operated 12 slipways simultaneously, 12 ships under construction at once. The shifts overlapped by 15 minutes. During those 15 minutes, the outgoing crew briefed the incoming crew. What sections had been completed? What sections were behind schedule? What problems had emerged? Then the outgoing crew left, and the incoming crew picked up the tools and continued. In 1942, without computers, without digital communication, this coordination happened through face-to-face handoffs, clipboards, and shouting. It worked. The only holidays in 1942 and 1945 were Christmas Day and New Year's Day. Even then, skeleton crews kept essential systems running. Richmond's population exploded from 20,000 in 1940 to over 100,000 by 1943. These were migrants from across America, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, the Deep South, drawn by high wages during the Great Depression's aftermath. They lived in hastily erected barracks. Kaiser built an entire city, Vanport, to house 42,000 workers and families. Vanport contained 9 houses on some 942 housing units. It was constructed in months. It was destroyed by flood in 1948, but in 1942-1945 it housed an army. At the peak of construction in late 1942, over 100,000 workers crowded the Richmond Kaiser Shipyards. 100,000. In 1940, Richmond's entire population was 20,000. By 1943, it was 130,000. The city grew by a factor of 6 in 3 years. Where did these workers come from? They came from everywhere. In 1942, jobs were scarce. Men traveled from Oklahoma, where the Dust Bowl had destroyed farms. They came from Arkansas, Texas, the Deep South. They came because Kaiser was paying $20 per hour, more than they could earn almost anywhere else. Women came too. By late 1942, women constituted 30% of the shipyard workforce. Before the war, most had never worked in a factory. Some had been waitresses, some homemakers, some farm laborers. Kaiser hired them all. He hired African Americans, immigrants, wounded veterans, men classified 4F, medically unfit for service. He hired people with physical disabilities. His philosophy was simple. If you can hold a welding torch, you can build a ship. A typical day in 1942 at the Richmond shipyards began at 6 o'clock a.m. for the day shift. Workers arrived by train, by bus, by car. Many rode the shipyard railway. At the gate, workers showed identification badges. Security was tight. This was wartime. Once inside, workers reported to their foreman. The foreman system in 1942 was the backbone of Kaiser's efficiency. Foreman had authority to make decisions on the spot. If a steel plate did not fit, the foreman could authorize cutting it down. If a welding seam failed inspection, the foreman could order it redone immediately. Decisions that would take months today, in 2025, were made in minutes back in 1942. The foremen were experienced. Many had come from Kaiser's dam building projects. They understood that every hour of delay meant another hour closer to losing the war. A welder in 1942 might spend her entire shift welding the same type of seam, over and over. Repetition bred speed. By 1943, experienced welders could lay 50 feet of seam in a single shift. The quality varied. Some seams were excellent, some adequate, some weak, but the work moved forward. Inspectors checked critical seams. Non-critical seams were often left uninspected. The philosophy was pragmatic. The ship needed to survive one transatlantic voyage. If it survived that, it was a success. This was not negligence. This was wartime calculus. In 1942, a foreman at the Richmond shipyards could authorize changes on the spot. Today, in 2025, the same decision requires approvals from multiple agencies, review by engineering committees, documentation for regulatory compliance. Consider the USS Gerald R. Ford, commissioned in 2017 after 12 years of construction. During the Ford's construction, the shipbuilder made 19,000 design changes. 19,000. Each change required documentation. Many required Navy approval. Some required approval from multiple oversight agencies. In 1942, the SS Robert E. Peary incorporated design changes during construction. The deck was pre-assembled in 7 sections instead of 23. The deck houses were fully outfitted before installation. These changes were made by foremen and engineers on the shipyard floor. No committees, no approval process, no environmental impact statements. Now consider the budget breakdown. In 1942, Kaiser Shipyards spent approximately 90% of their budget on actual construction: steel, welding equipment, cranes, labor. 10% went to administration and overhead. In 2025, on the USS Gerald R. Ford, the budget breakdown looks different. The Ford cost $13.3 billion to build, plus $5 billion in research and development. On major infrastructure projects in 2025, between 20 and 40% of the budget goes to regulatory compliance, environmental studies, legal fees, and consulting. The actual construction receives 60 to 80%. Compare this to 1942. In 1942, 90% of every dollar went to building the ship. In 2025, perhaps 60% goes to building the ship. The rest goes to lawyers, consultants, and paperwork. This is not theft. This is not corruption. This is the cost of safety, environmental protection, and regulatory compliance in 2025. But it is a cost. In 1942, speed killed workers. In 2025, safety kills speed. In 1942, workers built 3 ships per day. In 2025, we are building 1 ship per decade. The tools are better. The materials are stronger. The knowledge is deeper. But the capacity is gone. Stop. We need to talk about what it cost. In 1942, the Richmond shipyards were not safe places. They were industrial war zones. Inside the fabrication shops, the temperature in summer 1943 reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers welded steel in enclosed spaces with inadequate ventilation. The welding torches produced toxic fumes, vaporized copper, zinc, manganese. In 1942, there were no respirators. There were no air quality monitors. Workers breathed the fumes for 8 hours, 12 hours, sometimes longer. They did not know what they were breathing. The science of occupational toxicology, which we understand clearly in 2025, was primitive in 1942. Women welders at the Kaiser Shipyards were exposed to the same toxic metals as the men. Many workers who survived the war later developed respiratory diseases. Many died decades later from cancers linked to asbestos exposure. Asbestos was everywhere in 1942. It insulated pipes. It lined boiler rooms. It fireproofed bulkheads. Workers cut it, shaped it, installed it, breathed it. In 1942, asbestos was considered a miracle material. In 1973, the EPA began regulating it. By then, thousands of shipyard workers were already dying. The physical dangers in 1942 were immediate and brutal. Workers operated cranes that lifted 70-ton steel sections. If a cable snapped, the section fell. If a worker was underneath, the worker died. One woman at Richmond fractured her skull after a 60-foot fall from the top deck of a hull. She survived, many did not. The noise was constant. Welding torches hissed. Grinders shrieked. Cranes groaned. Hammers rang against steel. In 1942, there was no hearing protection. Workers went deaf slowly, over years, without realizing it. The safety equipment that existed in 1942 was minimal. Workers wore leather gloves, which shrank on their hands in summer heat. They wore canvas coveralls. They wore steel-toed boots when available. That was it. No hard hats, no safety harnesses, no fall protection, no respirators, no hearing protection. In 1942, before the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, this was considered acceptable. This was considered normal. This was considered the cost of doing business. The official death toll, recorded by private shipyards between 1943 and 1944, stands at approximately 700 workers killed in accidents. 700. But historians examining the records decades later believe the true number was higher. Some deaths were misclassified. Some were attributed to natural causes when the real cause was workplace injury or toxic exposure. We will never know the exact number. What we do know are the causes. Falls accounted for 39% of fatalities in American shipyards during 1943 to 1944. Workers fell from scaffolding, from ship decks, from crane platforms. Some fell 20 feet, some fell 60 feet, some fell into the water and drowned. At the Kaiser Richmond shipyards, first aid stations, and field hospitals treated 13,261 fractures between 1941 and 1945. Fractures to hands, feet, ribs. These were the survivors. These were the workers who fell and lived. The second most common cause of death, 25% of fatalities, was workers being struck by vehicles or loads. A crane swings a 50-ton steel section. The section shifts. A cable snaps. The section falls. Anyone underneath dies instantly. This happened over and over. Lucille Penny Price, an 18-year-old electrician from Oakland, witnessed a fatal accident on her first night of work at Yard 3 in October 1942. She never forgot it. Years later, she described her time at the shipyards. It wasn't all beer and Skittles. Price was injured repeatedly during her time at Kaiser. She cut herself using a linoleum knife to cut electrical cable. She got bits of steel mesh in her eyes, requiring treatment at the field hospital. She said she was in and out of the field hospital like a yo-yo. She was one of the lucky ones. She survived. In 1943, American shipyards reported an average of 33 disabling injuries per million hours worked. 33 disabling injuries per million hours means that for every 100 workers, approximately 7 were injured seriously enough to miss work in a given year. Over 4 years, from 1941 to 1945, with over 100,000 workers at the Richmond shipyards alone, the number of injuries ran into the tens of thousands. The exact count is lost to history. Why did they do it? Why did 100,000 men and women work in conditions that killed 700 of them in 2 years? The answer is not complicated. In 1942, during the lingering aftermath of the Great Depression, there were few choices. A worker at the Kaiser Shipyards in 1942 could earn $1.20 per hour, approximately $9.60 per day for an 8-hour shift. This was more than a farm laborer earned. This was more than a waitress earned. This was more than most factory workers earned. For many workers, this was the best opportunity they had ever seen. And there was the war. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered World War II. Suddenly, shipbuilding was not just a job. It was patriotic duty. Posters declared, "Build ships faster than the enemy can sink them." Workers believed they were fighting the war from the home front. They were right. But there was another reason, darker and simpler. They did not know the risks. The science of toxic exposure, which we understand clearly in 2025, was unknown in 1942. Workers did not know that breathing welding fumes would damage their lungs. They did not know that asbestos would kill them 30 years later. They did not know that the noise would deafen them, that the chemicals would poison them. They did not know what they were breathing, touching, inhaling, absorbing. The companies knew some of it. Medical research in the 1930s had already linked asbestos to lung disease, but the connection was not widely publicized. And even if it had been, would it have mattered? In 1942, with a war to win and U-boats sinking ships daily, worker safety was a secondary concern. Speed came first. Safety came later, or not at all. The speed of 1942 was not free. It was purchased with human lives. 700 shipyard workers died between 1943 and 1944. This is the official count. The real number was almost certainly higher. At the Richmond Kaiser Shipyards alone, with 100,000 workers at peak employment, the death rate was approximately 0.7% over 4 years. This does not sound like much. It sounds like a rounding error. But it was not. 700 families received telegrams. 700 funerals were held. 700 graves were dug. And for what? Kaiser's Richmond Shipyards, by the end of the war in 1945, had built $1.8 billion worth of ships. In 1942 dollars. That is approximately $33 billion in 2025 dollars. The shipyards built 747 ships. Divide $33 billion by 747 ships. Each ship cost approximately $44 million in today's dollars. Now divide that by the 700 workers who died. Each death in 1942 was worth approximately $47 million in productivity. Or, to put it another way, divide the 700 deaths by the 747 ships. Each ship cost approximately 0.94 human lives. 1 life per ship. This is not a moral judgment. This is arithmetic. Kaiser's profits during the war were substantial. The savings and the bonuses from the Maritime Commission for Early Delivery made Kaiser one of the wealthiest industrialists in America by 1945. The workers who died did not share in those profits. We in 2025 look back at this and call it exploitation. We call it criminal negligence. We call it unacceptable. And we are right. But we must also acknowledge what was built. In 1942, those 700 workers and the 100,000 who survived built 747 ships. Those ships carried 2/3 of all overseas cargo during World War II. Those ships supplied the troops who landed at Normandy. Those ships transported the ammunition that liberated Europe. Those ships won the war. Does this justify the deaths? No. Does this explain them? Yes. In 1942, the calculus was simple. Speed saves lives overseas, even if it costs lives at home. Build ships faster than the enemy can sink them, even if workers die building them. In 2025, we have rejected that calculus. We have decided, rightly, that worker safety is not negotiable. We have decided that no ship, no building, no infrastructure project is worth a human life. This is moral progress. But it came with a cost. The cost is time. We in 2025 do not build like they did in 1942, and that is a good thing. The 700 workers who died in American shipyards between 1943 and 1944 did not have to die. The 13,261 workers who suffered fractures at the Richmond Kaiser Shipyards did not have to be injured. The thousands more who developed lung diseases, cancers, and hearing loss decades later did not have to sacrifice their health. They were not heroes. They were victims. They were victims of an industrial system that valued speed over safety, that treated workers as expendable resources, that calculated human life in terms of dollars and delivery schedules. The safety regulations that exist today in 2025 would have saved them. The Occupational Safety and Health Act, signed into law on December 29, 1970, established mandatory safety standards for American workplaces. OSHA requires employers to provide personal protective equipment. It requires safety training. It requires hazard documentation. It requires regular inspections. It limits noise exposure. It controls toxic substances. It mandates fall protection. If OSHA had existed in 1942, many of those 700 workers would have lived. If asbestos regulations had existed in 1942, thousands of workers would not have died of cancer decades later. This is moral progress. We, in 2025, have decided that worker safety matters more than construction speed. We have decided that environmental protection matters more than industrial efficiency. We have decided that human life cannot be measured in dollars and deadlines. These are the right decisions, but they came with consequences. The turning point came on January 1st, 1970. On that day, President Richard Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act into law. NEPA was the first major environmental law in the United States. It was passed by Congress in December 1969. The Senate approved it on December 20th, the House on December 22nd. NEPA established a simple requirement. Before any major federal action, agencies must prepare a detailed statement on the environmental impact of the proposed action. This statement, the Environmental Impact Statement, must describe the environmental impact, any adverse effects that cannot be avoided, alternatives to the proposed action, the relationship between short-term uses and long-term productivity, and any irreversible commitments of resources. The EIS process involves multiple stages. An agency must publish a notice of intent. It must conduct a scoping process to identify issues. It must prepare a draft EIS and hold a public comment period, minimum 45 days. It must prepare a final EIS and hold another public comment period, minimum 30 days. It must issue a record of decision. Only then can construction begin. In 2009, federal agencies completed approximately 6,300 environmental assessments and 715 full environmental impact statements. The timeline for completing an EIS varies by project, but major infrastructure projects often take years. Before 1970, none of this existed. Before 1970, an engineer could design a shipyard, select a site, and begin construction within months. Henry Kaiser built his first Richmond shipyard starting in December 1940. The first keel was laid in April 1941, 4 months from groundbreaking to production. After 1970, this became impossible. After 1970, the same project would require an environmental impact statement. The EIS would need to assess impacts on air quality, water quality, soil contamination, noise pollution, endangered species, wetlands, historical sites, and environmental justice concerns. The draft EIS would require public comment. Environmental. Groups would review it. Citizens would challenge it. The process would take months, often years. Then there is the actual construction. OSHA, also signed into law in 1970, transformed workplace safety. Before 1970, employers had minimal legal obligations to protect workers. After 1970, employers must comply with detailed safety regulations. These regulations save lives, but they also add time. Consider a welding operation. In 1942, a worker trained for 2 weeks, picked up a torch, and started welding. In 2025, a welder trains for months or years. The welder must be certified. The welding equipment must meet safety standards. The work area must have adequate ventilation. The welds must be inspected using ultrasonic or radiographic testing. Documentation must be filed for every critical weld. This produces better welds, safer welds, stronger ships. But it takes longer. The irony, visible clearly in 2025, is that many of the regulations created to protect the environment now delay the very projects needed to address environmental challenges. Want to build a wind farm? Environmental impact statement required. Timeline: 18 to 36 months for approval, before construction even begins. Want to build a solar array on federal land? Environmental assessment required, potentially escalating to full EIS. Timeline: 12 to 24 months minimum. Want to build high-speed rail to reduce carbon emissions? Full EIS required. Timeline: 3 to 5 years for environmental review alone. The regulations designed in 1970 to protect the environment have become, in 2025, obstacles to environmental progress. This is not a malice. This is not failure. This is the unintended consequence of a system optimized for caution. In 1942, Kaiser Shipyards built the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. Today, in 2025, the United States Navy has spent 17 years building the USS Gerald R. Ford and it still experiences operational problems. The math is staggering. From 1941 to 1945, American shipyards built 2,110 Liberty ships. That is 677 ships per year. That is 1.85 ships per day, every day, for 4 years. In 2025, the United States is building Ford-class aircraft carriers at a rate of approximately 1 ship every 8 to 10 years. The USS Gerald R. Ford was commissioned in 2017. The USS John F. Kennedy is expected to be delivered in 2025, 8 years later. The USS Enterprise is expected in 2029, 4 years after that. 1 ship per decade. Now consider the crisis we face in 2025. Climate scientists warn that we must reduce global carbon emissions by 50% by 2030 to avoid catastrophic climate change. That is 5 years from now. To achieve this, we need to build massive amounts of clean energy infrastructure. Wind farms, solar arrays, nuclear power plants, high-speed rail, electric vehicle charging networks. We need to build fast. But we in 2025 cannot build fast. The California High-Speed Rail Project was approved by voters in 2008. Construction began in 2015. As of 2025, 17 years after voter approval, the project has completed 0 miles of operational high-speed track. The budget has ballooned from $33 billion to over $100 billion. The completion date has been pushed to the 2030s. The Vogtle nuclear power plant expansion in Georgia was approved in 2009. Construction began in 2013. Unit 3 became operational in 2023, 10 years later. Unit 4 became operational in 2024. The budget grew from $14 billion to over $30 billion. Offshore wind projects on the East Coast face years of environmental review, followed by years of permitting challenges, followed by legal challenges from environmental groups concerned about impacts on marine life and viewsheds. We need to build, but every project faces a gauntlet of reviews, approvals, studies, and lawsuits. In 1942, the enemy was Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The deadline was survival. The United States mobilized its entire industrial capacity and built faster than any nation in history. In 2025, the enemy is climate change. The deadline, according to scientists, is 2030 for 50% emission reductions, 2050 for net zero. But we in 2025 are not building it anywhere near the pace required. Why not? Because the system we built after 1970, the system designed to protect workers and the environment, is now preventing us from protecting the planet. This is the uncomfortable question. What are we in 2025 willing to risk? The workers of 1942 built the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. Approximately 700 of them died in shipyard accidents between 1943 and 1944. We, in 2025, have been trying to build the USS John F. Kennedy for 12 years. No workers have died during its construction. The SS Robert E. Peary sailed to war and saved American soldiers trapped on a Pacific island. The USS John F. Kennedy sits incomplete in a shipyard in Virginia, waiting for its weapons elevators to function correctly. What are we in 2025 willing to risk? The workers of 1942 were forced to sacrifice their lives. They had no choice. The system exploited them, discarded them, and moved on. We in 2025 have the opposite problem. We have built a system so focused on preventing harm that it prevents action. What were they, in 1942, forced to sacrifice? Their health, their safety, their lives, 700 deaths, 13,000 fractures, thousands more dying slowly from asbestos and toxic exposure. What are we in 2025 willing to risk? Apparently nothing. We will not risk bird strikes from wind turbines. We will not risk viewshed impacts from solar arrays. We will not risk traffic increases from housing developments. We will not risk any environmental harm, any community disruption, any change to the status quo. And so we build nothing. Or we build so slowly that the deadlines pass, the crises worsen, and the problems become unsolvable. Is there a way, in 2026 and beyond, to honor both the dead of 1942 and the living of 2025? Is there a way to build infrastructure that protects workers without paralyzing progress? Perhaps, but it will require something we, in 2025, seem incapable of: accepting trade-offs. In 1942, they accepted the trade-off. They chose speed over safety. 700 workers paid the price. In 2025, we refuse the trade-off. We demand both speed and safety, both progress and protection, both action and caution. We demand the impossible, and so we get nothing. The deadline is approaching. Climate scientists say we have 5 years to cut emissions 50%. Infrastructure is crumbling. Housing is unaffordable. Energy grids are strained. We need to build fast. But we, in 2025, with our superior tools and superior knowledge and superior materials, cannot seem to build anything. The SS Robert E. Peary, completed in 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes in November 1942, served for 21 years. It sailed through World War II, carrying supplies to the Pacific, transporting ammunition to combat zones, saving American soldiers under fire. It survived the war that killed 700 of the workers who built ships like it. In June 1963 in Baltimore, Maryland, the Peary was scrapped, cut apart, melted down, the steel recycled. Today, in 2025, 83 years after the Peary was launched, only 3 Liberty ships still exist. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien floats in San Francisco. The SS John W. Brown sits in Baltimore. The SS Red Oak Victory is preserved in Richmond, California, a few miles from where Kaiser's Yard No. 2 once stood. The Red Oak Victory is a museum ship now. Visitors walk its decks on weekends. They see the cargo holds, the engine room, the crew quarters. They read plaques about the workers who built it, the women welders, the black laborers, the 4F men who could not serve in uniform but served in the shipyards. The visitors take photographs. They marvel at the craftsmanship. They say, they don't build them like this anymore. They are right, but not for the reasons they think. We, in 2025, do not build ships like the Liberty ships because we cannot, not because we lack the knowledge, not because we lack the tools, but because we lack the will. We have chosen rightly not to build ships that cost 0.94 lives each. We have chosen rightly not to expose workers to toxic fumes and crushing injuries and 60-foot falls. We have chosen rightly to value human life over construction deadlines. But we have also chosen, perhaps without fully understanding what we were choosing, not to build at the pace the Liberty ships were built. We have chosen process over speed. We have chosen caution over capacity. We have chosen safety over scale. And so the capacity is lost. The Red Oak Victory will outlast the USS Gerald R. Ford. The Liberty ships, built in weeks in 1942, were designed to last one transatlantic voyage. Many lasted decades. The Ford, built over 17 years with cutting-edge technology, is already experiencing failures in its advanced systems. When the Red Oak Victory finally fails, perhaps in 2050, perhaps in 2075, will anyone remember how it was built? Will anyone remember the 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes? Will anyone remember the 100,000 workers who swarmed the Richmond shipyards in 1942? Will anyone remember the 700 who died? Will anyone remember what we could do back in 1942 when survival demanded it? Or will we, in 2050 or 2075 or 2100, stand on the deck of a museum ship and say, they don't build them like this anymore, and never ask why?